Picture a really sweltering, just brutally humid afternoon, deep in the industrial corridor of Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah, right in the thick of it.
Exactly. The air is heavy, and you've got this putrid metallic scent from the chemical factories and the sewage runoff nearby. And standing right at the epicenter of this bleak landscape is Delaney Hall.
Which is just this massive, imposing fortress.
Totally. It's an immigration detention center ringed by high walls, dense coils of razor wire. But right now, the facility itself is almost obscured by just sheer chaos erupting outside its gates.
Right, the access roads are completely choked off.
Yeah. You've got makeshift barricades frantically built out of splintered wooden pallets, discarded mattresses, stolen traffic cones just piled haphazardly across the asphalt. And pushing against those barricades is a heavily militarized force of federal agents.
Full tactical armor.
Full armor. Faces completely hidden by gas masks and riot visors. And they are moving in these synchronized, aggressive formations to break the civilian lines. They're deploying expanding batons, firing pepper balls at point-blank range, and utilizing tasers that are leaving bodies rigid on the ground.
It's essentially a localized war zone.
It really is. And right in the absolute thick of this pandemonium, coughing, gasping for oxygen as a cloud of chemical irritant washes over him, is a sitting United States Senator, Andy Kim.
Unbelievable.
Alongside his staff, they arrived hoping to de-escalate the situation. But the crazy part? The powder keg that caused all of this to explode, it isn't even happening on the street.
No, it's behind the wire.
Exactly. Behind that razor wire, hundreds of detainees have launched a desperate multi-day hunger and labor strike, starving themselves to protest conditions they describe as a literal waking nightmare.
Yeah.
But before we really get into the weeds of this, real quick, please make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and hit the notification bell so you stay updated on all our future discussions.
Yes, definitely do that.
And I also want to give a very quick 15-second update on the Martin Stevens versus OpenAI matter.
Oh, right.
So just to clarify, it is not a lawsuit yet. We are currently in a voluntary quiet period that was requested by Stevens. We're hoping for a settlement, but there's no progress or discussions that are known publicly right now.
Right. And we should mention the dead man's switch hasn't been activated, so Stevens is physically and legally safe.
Exactly. Safe and sound for now. Anyway, welcome to the debate. Today, we are dissecting an incredibly volatile intersection of, well, constitutional law, humanitarian crises, and jurisdictional warfare.
It's a massive knot to untangle.
It is. The central question we have to answer today is this. How do we strike the balance of power between state sovereignty and federal authority when it comes to immigration enforcement, particularly when a sovereign state attempts to aggressively regulate private detention contractors over grave human rights concerns?
And the stakes of that question, they couldn't be higher. Because what we're witnessing in New Jersey isn't just some abstract legal thought experiment.
Right.
It's the physical manifestation of a completely broken constitutional relationship. We've got comprehensive, on-the-ground reporting of this massive hunger strike at Delaney Hall. We're reckoning with fiercely combative, almost retributive statements coming directly from the Department of Homeland Security.
Yep, they did not hold back.
Not at all. And underneath all this physical and political violence, we really have to analyze the deeply fractured, incredibly consequential Third Circuit Court of Appeals decision in the case of CoreCivic Inc. versus the governor of New Jersey.
Right. So to clearly establish where I stand on this, I represent the position that federal supremacy in immigration enforcement is not just a preference. It is a strict constitutional requirement.
Okay.
I argue that the state of New Jersey is attempting to use corporate regulation as a back door, essentially, to nullify federal law. And both the Third Circuit's ruling striking down that attempt and the forceful federal security response at Delaney Hall are necessary to protect core federal functions from hostile state sabotage.
Well, and my position is that the United States relies upon the bedrock principle of dual sovereignty. States possess the inherent constitutional police power to regulate private corporations operating within their borders.
Even federal contractors?
Yes. especially to prevent humanitarian abuses. By cloaking for-profit prison companies in the armor of federal sovereign immunity, the federal government is dangerously overreaching, both through judicial activism in the courts and by deploying militarized force on the streets of New Jersey.
Okay, so we need to dive straight into the operational realities driving this crisis, because the United States Constitution places immigration exclusively within the purview of the federal government.
Under the plenary power doctrine, sure.
Exactly. It's not a shared responsibility like environmental regulation or highway maintenance. The federal government alone dictates who enters, who is removed, and how they are detained pending those proceedings.
Right, but how they outsource that detention is the issue.
Well, when New Jersey passed Assembly Bill 5207, which explicitly bans state, local, and private entities from entering into civil immigration detention contracts, they weren't just engaging in standard corporate oversight.
They were exercising their police powers.
No, they were weaponizing their state legislature to starve the federal government of the physical infrastructure required to execute its constitutional mandate. If you destroy the marketplace for federal detention, you effectively destroy the federal government's ability to enforce the law.
I don't see it as destruction.
It is textbook nullification. And the downstream effect of that legal sabotage is the physical violence we are seeing outside Delaney Hall. Because when New Jersey leverages its sanctuary policies, specifically the Immigrant Trust Directive, to order local police to stand down and abandon federal agents, they create an incredibly dangerous vacuum.
They're just refusing to use state resources for federal tasks.
That agitators are actively barricading federal law enforcement facilities. They're throwing projectiles, they're blocking the transport of detainees. ICE agents are entirely isolated in hostile territory. Under those conditions, federal officers have an absolute obligation to deploy the force necessary to secure their perimeter and protect their personnel.
You're framing this as if New Jersey just went rogue and declared independence.
Functionally, in this specific area, they basically did.
I look at the mechanical function of state power very differently. The American constitutional architecture specifically preserves the police powers of the states. That's the authority to regulate health, safety, and welfare.
For their own citizens, yes.
And for corporate entities operating on their soil. This inherently includes the right to regulate the behavior of private for-profit corporations. New Jersey utilized that exact traditional police power to ban private prisons, and they didn't target the federal government specifically.
Oh, come on, of course they did.
No, look at the law. The state applies this exact same restriction to itself. They ban private criminal detention for state inmates, too. It is a sincerely held state policy that human incarceration should not be a profit-driven enterprise.
But applying it to ICE destroys ICE's operational capacity.
The federal government choosing to outsource its constitutional duties to private entities like CoreCivic or the GEO Group does not magically erase New Jersey's jurisdiction over those private entities. When you grant these billion-dollar corporations federal sovereign immunity, you strip away the only layer of oversight that actually functions.
Federal oversight functions.
Does it? Because that stripping of oversight leads directly to the horrifying, unlivable conditions inside Delaney Hall. The violence on the street isn't the result of state sabotage.
Then what is it?
It is the inevitable reaction of a community watching its neighbors suffer profound human rights abuses while the federal government deploys chemical weapons and tasers against civilians, street medics, and elected officials just to shield a corporate contractor from accountability.
I think calling it shielding a contractor is missing the federal prerogative entirely.
And when the Department of Homeland Security then threatens to shut down international flights at Newark Liberty International Airport as a form of economic retribution, it ceases to be about law enforcement and becomes outright coercive federal tyranny.
Okay, let's pause and look at the actual accusations regarding the conditions inside the facility, because this is precisely where we need to start dissecting this. The reality of what is happening behind the razor wire is highly disputed.
I wouldn't say highly disputed when we have the evidence we do.
It is disputed by the people running the facility. We have to look at the mechanics of the hunger strike itself, because it's the stated justification for both the state's legislative intervention and the public's physical blockade.
Fine. Let's look closely at the reality inside Delaney Hall as described by the people actually living it.
According to exhaustive reporting, internal communications provided by activist groups like Eyes on Ice, recently released detainees, and the families of those currently incarcerated, we are looking at a systemic humanitarian collapse.
A collapse is a strong word.
Between 200 and 400 detainees initiated a highly coordinated hunger and labor strike. To understand the gravity of that, we have to look at what specifically drove them to collective starvation.
They claim it's the conditions.
The complaints detail food that isn't just, unappetizing or lacking nutritional value, it is actively contaminated. Detainees are reporting finding worms and maggots squirming in their provided meals.
Right, which the federal government and the GEO Group categorically deny. But let's lay out the entirety of the allegations before we evaluate the evidence.
Fair enough. The contaminated food is almost secondary to the structural and medical failures anyway. Detainees cite a total lack of air conditioning in a facility built in a dense industrial heat island.
In Newark, in the summer, yeah.
Exactly. Combined with non-existent ventilation, this stagnant air has allowed a severe strain of the flu, along with a widespread lice infestation, to just tear through the population unchecked.
In close quarters, viruses spread. That happens in any carceral setting.
But the core of the grievance is catastrophic medical neglect. And we aren't just relying on anonymous detainee accounts here. We have corroboration from multiple United States Congress members.
You mean the partisan representatives who toured it?
Representatives Jerry Nadler, Dan Goldman, and Adriano Espaillat. They physically toured the facility. They emerged and detailed horrifying specifics.
Anecdotes that they were told by detainees.
They documented the case of a woman who discovered a lump in her breast and had been waiting over a month for a basic mammogram, receiving absolutely no diagnostic care.
Well, scheduling outside medical visits for detainees does involve logistical hurdles.
A month for a potential breast cancer diagnosis? They also cited a man suffering from colon cancer whose condition was actively deteriorating because he was receiving zero specialized treatment.
Again, these are specific medical files we don't have public access to, so we are relying on secondhand descriptions.
The universal treatment for virtually any agonizing condition in the facility is reportedly a single dose of Tylenol. Representative Espaillat publicly and unequivocally called the conditions inhumane.
He's a politician making a political statement.
And we must constantly remind ourselves of the legal framework here. These are civil immigration detainees. They are not convicted criminals serving punitive sentences.
That is legally true, yes.
Under the law, civil detention cannot be punitive in nature. Yet they are subjected to conditions that would trigger an immediate emergency intervention in a standard state penitentiary.
Look, the distinction between civil and punitive detention is legally crucial. I agree with you there. But let's critically examine the mechanism of how these allegations are verified and amplified.
By speaking to the people suffering them?
We are operating in an intensely polarized environment where hyperbole is frequently deployed as a tactical weapon. Look at the direct response from the Department of Homeland Security, specifically Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen and Acting Assistant Secretary Lauren Biss.
Right, their complete denial.
They don't just dispute the severity of the conditions, they categorically deny the fundamental premise of the strike as presented by the advocates. Secretary Mullen stated on the record, there is no hunger strike at Delaney Hall. There are no subprime conditions.
Which is a frankly staggering level of gaslighting.
He characterized the entire narrative as a highly orchestrated political stunt, driven by sanctuary politicians who are utilizing exaggerated claims to generate fundraising and political capital.
It defies basic logic to dismiss the coordinated actions of hundreds of people as a mere stunt. People don't starve themselves for a stunt.
If they are organized by outside activists, they might.
You do not have multiple federal lawmakers walking out of a facility visibly shaken, demanding its closure if everything is functioning smoothly according to standard protocols.
You do, if those lawmakers have a pre-existing ideological commitment to abolishing ICE entirely, which many of the politicians supporting these protests explicitly do.
Oh, so they're just making up colon cancer?
No, I'm saying they frame standard medical delays as deliberate torture. Let's look at the actual operational oversight mechanisms. The GEO Group, the private contractor running Delaney Hall, does not operate in the dark.
They operate behind a veil of corporate secrecy.
They are bound by the ICE Performance-Based National Detention Standards, or PBNDS. These are incredibly detailed, rigorous federal guidelines that dictate everything from caloric intake to medical response times.
Guidelines that are frequently ignored, as documented by ICE's own internal watchdogs.
GEO Group issued formal statements confirming that they provide round-the-clock medical care, that every meal is approved by a certified dietitian, that they offer religious and specialty diets, and maintain continuous virtual and in-person legal access.
That's a PR statement. Of course they said that.
Furthermore, these facilities undergo regular inspections by independent industry accreditation bodies. Secretary Mullen detailed that detainees have continuous access to clean water, bedding, toiletries, and 3 scheduled meals a day.
Then why are they refusing the meals?
His assertion, which aligns with the reality of running a secure facility populated by diverse nationalities, is that some detainees are refusing meals not because the food is infested with maggots,
Right.
but simply because they are dissatisfied with institutional food and are demanding, in his words, food from their native country. He bluntly noted this isn't a Holiday Inn.
That is incredibly dismissive.
When a facility is maintaining its federal accreditations and passing its PBNDS inspections, we have to consider the probability that these synchronized protests are precisely what the president suggested: coordinated political theater.
Theater.
Yes, they are utilizing the public's natural empathy to force a change in federal immigration law through outside public pressure rather than through proper legislative channels.
That reliance on federal oversight mechanisms requires a profound, almost naive trust in a system that is literally designed to police itself.
It's the federal government. It polices itself by definition.
The GEO Group has a billion-dollar financial imperative to retain its federal contracts. Of course, their public relations statements will assert total compliance, and relying on ICE's internal PBNDS inspections completely ignores years of documented investigations by the Department of Homeland Security's own Office of Inspector General.
The OIG finds administrative errors, yes.
They have repeatedly found massive discrepancies between what private contractors claim on paper and the squalid realities inside their walls. We're talking about unannounced inspections finding mold, rotting food, and severe medical understaffing.
But applying that to Delaney Hall specifically right now is a leap.
But even setting the OIG reports aside, let's examine how GEO Group mechanically responded to the strike. If this were truly just a few detainees skipping meals because they missed native cuisine, the facility would simply monitor their health and let it pass.
Which they claim they did.
But advocates report highly aggressive, retaliatory tactics designed to psychologically and physically break the detainees. Facility staff reportedly began confiscating communication tablets from the units.
Which could be a security measure during a disturbance.
They deliberately severed the detainees' ability to communicate with their lawyers and families on the outside. They entirely cut access to the commissary.
Again, standard protocol to control contraband during a strike.
Most damningly, they allegedly began randomly shutting off the water supply to the housing units and leaving the high-intensity overhead lights on 24 hours a day.
Allegedly.
Those are tactics historically associated with psychological warfare, not standard carceral management. We have the chilling account of a released detainee named Luis who spoke to reporters on the condition of anonymity due to a highly justified fear of retaliation affecting his pending immigration case.
Okay.
He described a fellow hunger striker literally fainting from malnutrition. Instead of initiating an emergency medical response, the facility staff allegedly did nothing.
That seems highly improbable if medical staff were present.
He said they did nothing, forcing the other detainees to frantically revive the man themselves using a mixture of saved salt and sugar water. You cannot dismiss that as political theater.
I find it hard to believe trained medical staff just watched someone pass out and did nothing.
Human beings do not willingly starve themselves for a week over a culinary preference. They resort to the extreme destruction of their own bodies when they are trapped in a system devoid of due process,
They have due process. They are waiting for their hearings.
where their basic autonomy has been entirely stripped away and where drawing public attention is the literal only weapon they have left.
Look, I will concede that the psychological toll of indefinite civil detention is immense. And the environment is inherently austere. It is a carceral setting, and by definition, it is restrictive.
highly restrictive.
Furthermore, the labor aspect you mentioned earlier, where detainees are paid $1 a day to run the kitchen and laundry, is part of the ICE voluntary work program.
Voluntary is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
It is legally classified as voluntary. Though I understand the argument that in a closed environment where commissary funds are needed for basic comforts, the line between voluntary and coercive can blur.
If they don't work, they can't buy basic hygiene items or phone time.
However, we cannot abandon objective systemic evaluation in favor of highly emotive, unverified anecdotes amplified by organizations with explicit political agendas. Look at the perimeter of the facility.
Okay, let's look at it.
The people organizing the protest are literally wearing shirts that say, "Abolish ICE." Their stated objective is not to improve the air conditioning or ensure faster mammograms.
It can be both.
Their objective is the complete systemic dismantling of federal immigration enforcement. When the overarching goal is abolition, every standard operational grievance gets hyperinflated into a narrative of torture.
I think the cancer patient would disagree that his grievance is standard.
We must view claims of maggots in the food through the lens of that broader informational warfare. If the federal government capitulates every time a coordinated group of detainees issues unverified claims of abuse and initiates a hunger strike, you fundamentally surrender operational control of the entire federal detention apparatus.
So the alternative is just ignoring them?
You can't transfer authority from the federal executive branch to the detainees and their political allies on the outside. That's not how a functioning government operates.
The presence of abolitionist activists outside the facility does not magically cure the colon cancer of the man inside the facility.
I never said it did.
You are using the political motivations of the protesters to invalidate the very real verified medical neglect documented by sitting members of Congress.
Verified by who? By the activists?
But this perfectly transitions us to the inevitable consequence of the federal government's posture, because the federal response has essentially been to gaslight the detainees, denying the strike exists, blaming it on picky eating, dismissing the oversight of local politicians. The pressure inside the facility had nowhere to go but out.
Right.
The conflict spilled over the razor wire and onto the streets of Newark, transforming a legal and humanitarian dispute into a physical, violent confrontation.
And the mechanics of that street confrontation demonstrate exactly why federal supremacy must be maintained. The multi-day standoff outside Delaney Hall over the Memorial Day weekend escalated into an unprecedented disruption of federal operations.
It was a massive protest, yes.
The protesters did not merely assemble on the sidewalk to exercise their First Amendment rights. They actively laid siege to the facility. They engaged in organized tactical blockades.
They were trying to stop transfers.
Demonstrators locked arms to form human chains across the access roads. They dragged wooden pallets, construction materials, umbrellas, and mattresses into the street to construct physical fortifications designed to impede the movement of ICE transport vehicles.
Right, because ICE was trying to move the hunger strike leaders.
In one highly documented incident, protesters surrounded a transport van that was attempting to transfer a detainee named Martin Soto. His wife, Gabriela Soto, was one of the lead organizers of the outside protest.
Exactly.
The crowd swarmed the federal vehicle, physically striking the windows and the chassis, attempting to block its path. When a civilian crowd actively barricades a law enforcement facility, constructs physical fortifications, and swarms federal vehicles, they fundamentally cross the line from protected, peaceful protest into unlawful, dangerous agitation.
That's a very clinical way to describe a desperate family.
They are impeding the lawful execution of federal duties.
I find the characterization of a panicked wife as an unlawful agitator profoundly lacking in context. Gabriela Soto and the other families believed, with historical justification, that Martin Soto, who was instrumental in organizing the internal strike, was being punishably transferred to a remote, out-of-state facility.
ICE transfers detainees for logistical reasons all the time.
Specifically to silence him and break the strike's leadership. That is a known ICE tactic. She banged on the window of a van taking her husband away.
And the crowd swarmed the van.
And the response to that from the federal government was a staggering, disproportionate deployment of militarized force. We are talking about heavily armored federal agents, their identities completely concealed, charging aggressively into a crowd of civilians.
To clear the roadway.
They didn't just push people back. They utilized specialized, highly punitive crowd control weaponry. They fired pepper balls, which are essentially paintballs filled with chemical irritants that burst upon impact.
They are a standard, non-lethal riot control tool.
They caused severe respiratory distress and temporary blindness. A photographer reporting for The Guardian documented at least 7 credentialed journalists being directly pepper sprayed while trying to cover the event.
If you stand in a riot line, you assume the risk.
We have reports of ICE agents chasing a fleeing protester across dangerous, uneven gravel train tracks and shooting him in the back with a taser, causing his body to go completely rigid before they dragged him behind their lines.
We don't know what that individual did prior to fleeing.
Most disturbingly, there are multiple credible allegations that ICE agents actively utilized targeting strategies against street medics, the individuals clearly marked and present specifically to provide first aid.
Medics at protests are often just activists in Red Cross t-shirts.
Kathy O'Leary, a coordinator for the advocacy group Pax Christi, New Jersey, detailed an incident where ICE agents rushed past a line of general protesters explicitly shouting, "Eyes on the target," to deliberately grab Adam Marshall, a U.S. Army veteran acting as a medic.
He was interfering with their perimeter.
They allegedly pulled him into the facility, detained him, and then dumped him on a random street an hour later. That is not crowd control. That is a punitive, targeted assault on medical personnel and journalists.
You are completely ignoring the operational reality and the physical threat profile that those ICE agents were facing on the ground.
I don't think I am.
Secretary Mullen is explicitly reported that federal officers were actively assaulted by rioters. They had unknown chemical substances sprayed directly into their faces and onto their gear by agitators in the crowd.
Unknown chemicals?
Yes. 2 individuals were formally arrested for the federal crime of assaulting law enforcement officers. To understand why ICE had to deploy specialized crowd control tactics, you have to look at the mechanical breakdown of intergovernmental cooperation here.
Okay, explain the breakdown.
Think of Delaney Hall not just as a building, but conceptually like a United States embassy located in a highly hostile foreign territory.
Wait, an embassy? Newark is not a foreign country.
Bear with me. In a normal functioning domestic environment, if a massive protest erupts outside a federal building, the local city police or the state patrol handle the exterior perimeter.
Right.
They manage the traffic, they enforce the municipal noise ordinances, and they ensure the federal agents can safely ingress and egress. But in New Jersey, that fundamental layer of security has been legislatively stripped away.
Because of the Trust Directive.
Exactly. New Jersey operates under the Immigrant Trust Directive, a strict sanctuary policy that effectively prohibits local and state law enforcement from providing operational assistance to ICE.
As is their right under the 10th Amendment.
Former President Trump explicitly highlighted this dynamic, praising the professionalism of the New Jersey police forces, but pointing out that their governor forces them to stand down and abandon federal officers.
They aren't abandoning anyone. They just aren't doing ICE's job.
When the state deliberately orders its police to retreat, leaving a small contingent of federal agents completely isolated against a hostile, barricading crowd, what alternative exists?
They can call for federal backup.
If the local host government refuses to provide security outside the gates of the embassy guards have absolutely no choice but to push the perimeter back themselves.
By pepper spraying medics?
When agitators are throwing barricades and wielding mattresses to block federal transports, ICE must clear that roadway. They utilized non-lethal force, pepper balls, and tasers precisely to avoid a lethal confrontation while maintaining basic operational continuity.
The embassy analogy fundamentally fails because New Jersey is not a foreign adversary. It is a sovereign state within a constitutional republic.
But functionally, they are acting hostile to the federal government.
The 10th Amendment's anti-commandeering doctrine explicitly prohibits the federal government from forcing state and local police to execute federal laws. New Jersey's Immigrant Trust Directive is a completely lawful exercise of state sovereignty.
I'm not saying it's unlawful. I'm saying it creates the tactical crisis.
The state is simply saying, we will not spend our local tax dollars and utilize our local officers to facilitate your broken immigration system. ICE is an immensely funded federal agency. If they require perimeter security, they need to provide it themselves without resorting to hunting down street medics.
Which is exactly what they were doing, providing their own security.
And the idea that their force was measured and necessary completely disintegrates when you look at the most politically explosive moment of the entire standoff.
You mean the senator?
Yes, United States Senator Andy Kim, accompanied by his staff and alongside Governor Mike Shrill, arrived at the facility specifically to utilize his authority to de-escalate the tension.
He walked into a riot line.
He wasn't throwing barricades. He was attempting to open a dialogue between the agents and the crowd. For his efforts, he and his staff were caught in the crossfire and pepper-sprayed by federal agents on American soil.
Because the crowd was surging.
Senator Kim stated that instead of engaging with him to calm the situation, ICE escalated by deploying an armored vehicle and essentially pouring gasoline on a fire. When your crowd control tactics result in the chemical spraying of a sitting U.S. senator trying to establish peace, your tactics are fundamentally out of control.
I disagree completely with the premise that Senator Kim was acting as a neutral peacekeeper in that moment.
He's a senator.
When a tactical law enforcement operation is actively underway, when officers have been assaulted, when the perimeter has been breached by barricades, a politician cannot simply walk into the middle of the riot line and expect the operation to halt for a town hall meeting.
He's a federal representative overseeing federal agents.
Secretary Mullen was incredibly blunt about this reality. He noted that Senator Kim was complaining to the media about being hit by pepper spray when he fundamentally had no business inserting himself into the middle of an active, volatile security zone.
No business? He represents that state.
It is performative political theater, and it actively jeopardizes the safety of the officers who are trying to secure the area. The fact that a senator was exposed to pepper spray doesn't prove ICE was out of control.
It proves they were firing indiscriminately.
It proves a situation created by the protesters was so chaotic that even VIPs couldn't safely navigate it. And this brings us to the ultimate tool the federal government has to utilize when a state engages in this level of systemic obstruction.
Oh, you mean the extortion threat?
New Jersey has made a calculated, holistic decision to blockade federal immigration enforcement. They refuse local police assistance through the Trust Directive. They attempt to ban the physical facilities through legislation. They allow massive disruptive protests to choke off access roads.
They are exercising states' rights.
Faced with a state actively trying to sabotage its mission, the Department of Homeland Security has to utilize every lever of federal power to force compliance and ensure the safety of its personnel.
And the lever DHS chose to pull reveals the deeply coercive, almost extortionate nature of their current leadership.
It was a warning about resource allocation.
Secretary Mullen went on national television and issued an extraordinary, unprecedented threat. He stated that if radical left politicians in sanctuary cities continue to prevent ICE from enforcing federal laws, the Department of Homeland Security might pull Customs and Border Protection (CBP) officers and completely halt the processing of international flights at Newark Liberty International Airport.
Because they need the manpower.
Let's carefully unpack the mechanics of that threat. Newark Airport is a massive economic engine, not just for New Jersey, but for the entire northeastern United States. Secretary Mullen is threatening to unilaterally shut down the international hub of a sovereign state's economy.
If they don't have the personnel to run it, they have to shut it down.
Exercising their 10th Amendment rights to direct their own police, and because citizens are exercising their First Amendment rights to protest. That has absolutely nothing to do with crowd control at Delaney Hall, and it has nothing to do with immigration enforcement.
They are both DHS.
It is an act of economic blackmail. It is a punitive, coercive threat designed to inflict massive financial pain on the citizens of New Jersey until their elected officials submit to the policy preferences of the federal executive branch.
You are viewing that threat exclusively through a lens of political malice.
Because it was delivered with political malice.
But I look at it through the strict lens of resource allocation and logistical necessity. The Department of Homeland Security does not have infinite manpower.
They have a massive budget.
If the ICE agents stationed in Newark are constantly bogged down by organized riots, if they are unable to safely transport detainees without being swarmed, and if they are operating in an incredibly hostile environment where the local government completely refuses to provide standard perimeter security, DHS has a fundamental duty to protect its agents.
By shutting down an airport?
They have to pull personnel from somewhere to reinforce the facility and ensure basic safety. CBP and ICE fall under the same departmental umbrella.
That's a convenient excuse.
Pulling CBP officers from airport customs duty to reinforce the ICE agents besieged at Delaney Hall is a logistical necessity brought on entirely by New Jersey's own obstructionism.
No, it's retaliation.
That highlights a critical, undeniable truth of the Federalist system. A state cannot simultaneously demand all the massive economic benefits of federal infrastructure, like the operation of a major international airport, while actively, legislatively, and physically sabotaging the federal law enforcement officers operating in their own backyard. Actions have consequences.
That is an incredibly sanitized post-hoc rationalization of Mullen's actual threat.
He was just stating the reality of the manpower shortage.
He did not couch his statement in the language of logistical resource management. He didn't say, we have a critical manpower shortage at Delaney Hall and need to temporarily reassign 50 officers for the weekend.
He doesn't have to give a boardroom presentation. He was making a point on TV.
He explicitly framed the potential airport shutdown as direct retaliation against sanctuary cities. It is the federal government acting like a cartel, saying, submit to our operational demands or we will crash your airline and tourism industries.
That is a total mischaracterization.
Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman captured the absolute absurdity and cruelty of this dynamic perfectly. She summarized the federal posture as, help us abuse these black and brown people and line the pockets of our private prison donors, or I will crash the airline industry.
Well, that is pure distilled political hyperbole from a politician playing to her base.
Is it, though?
But Representative Coleman's quote actually points us directly to the foundational legal conflict that created this entire mess. The protesters are on the street outside Delaney Hall, and DHS is scrambling for resources precisely because New Jersey attempted to handle this dispute through unprecedented state legislation.
Unprecedented. Regulating corporations is standard.
And the federal courts categorically struck it down. The violence on the ground is the symptom. The constitutional law is the disease.
Right, the core civic case.
We must examine the lawsuit over New Jersey's Assembly Bill 5207, Core Civic Inc. versus Murphy, which was recently decided by the Third Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yes, this is where the constitutional theory meets the grim reality of the carceral state.
Exactly.
The New Jersey legislature passed AB 5207, a law that explicitly prohibits state agencies, local governments, and crucially, private entities from entering into, renewing, or extending any agreements to detain individuals for civil immigration purposes.
Right, a total ban.
The legislative intent was clear. New Jersey was utilizing its police powers to protect human rights and public health, pointing directly to the systemic, abhorrent conditions like the medical neglect and contaminated food that we've been debating today.
But they aimed it solely at immigration detention.
And initially, the law functioned exactly as intended. As existing contracts expired, local county jails in Bergen, Essex, and Hudson counties ceased housing IC detainees. The state effectively cleared out the municipal involvement in immigration detention.
Which left only the private actors.
That left only the purely private facilities. CoreCivic's Elizabeth Detention Center and subsequently the newly reopened Delaney Hall, operated by Geo Group.
Exactly. And CoreCivic, recognizing that this state law would functionally outlaw their entire business model within New Jersey, sued the state. They argued that AB 5207 violated the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution.
Yes, they sued to protect their profits.
And they won. Judge Stephanos Bibas, a Trump appointee writing for the majority in the Third Circuit, delivered what is essentially a masterclass in the modern application of intergovernmental immunity.
A masterclass in judicial overreach, more like.
To understand why he ruled this way, we have to look at the history of the doctrine. Intergovernmental immunity stems from the legendary 1819 Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland.
Which was about a federal bank.
In that case, the state of Maryland tried to heavily tax the Second Bank of the United States to drive it out of business. Chief Justice John Marshall famously declared that the power to tax involves the power to destroy, and established the bedrock rule that states cannot directly regulate or tax the federal government, nor can they discriminate against it.
The federal government, yes, not private corporations.
Now, the drafters of New Jersey's AB 527 thought they were being incredibly clever. They crafted the statutory language very carefully. They argued in court, look at the text. We aren't regulating the federal government. The law never mentions ICE or DHS. It only regulates private, for-profit contractors and local municipal governments.
Which is entirely accurate.
They said, we are simply exercising our traditional state police powers over corporate entities.
Which is a factually and legally unassailable statement. The text of the law is entirely neutral. It regulates corporate behavior within state lines.
But Judge Bibas refused to be blinded by the superficial text. He applied a rigorous functionalist approach.
Functionalist meaning he ignored the text.
He wrote that the courts must look through form and behind labels to substance. You have to examine the mechanical reality of the market. Civil immigration detention is a monopsony.
A monopsony?
Yes, it is a market where the federal government is the single solitary buyer of the service. Therefore, banning private companies from selling that specific service functionally and completely destroys the federal marketplace.
But it doesn't ban the federal government from doing it themselves.
If you regulate the only supplier, you are inherently regulating the only consumer. Consider a historical analogy. Imagine if during wartime, a state governor decided he opposed the federal military presence in his state.
War is a very different scenario than civil detention.
So the state passes a law banning any private business from selling food, fuel, or medical supplies to the U.S. Army. The state could utilize the exact same defense New Jersey used. We are only regulating private businesses.
But food and fuel are general markets.
But the functional, mechanical fact is a direct, crippling regulation on the operational capacity of the federal government. Judge Bibas rightly recognized that AB 5207 was a hostile regulation deliberately laid upon the contract of the government.
That's a massive leap.
It was designed explicitly to nullify ICE's discretion to utilize private contractors, a discretion that Congress explicitly granted them under the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Your explanation of Judge Bibas's functionalist approach perfectly highlights its fundamental flaw, a flaw that Judge Thomas Ambrose meticulously tore apart in his fierce dissenting opinion in that exact same case.
Judge Ambrose's dissent is very rigid.
Judge Ambrose's dissent is a defense of actual constitutional text against judicial invention. Let's look at the mechanical rules of intergovernmental immunity. The doctrine protects the federal government itself, its direct agencies, and entities that are so deeply integrated with the government that they essentially stand in its shoes.
CoreCivic stands in icy shoes when detaining people.
No, they don't. A massive, publicly traded, billion-dollar corporation like CoreCivic or Geo Group is not the federal government. They are independent, profit-seeking contractors.
They are performing a federal function.
They have their own shareholders, their own boards of directors, and their own massive liability structures. States have possessed the unquestioned power to regulate private contractors operating within their borders since the founding of the Republic.
But now when it discriminates against the federal government.
Judge Ambrose pointed out that New Jersey's law is entirely neutral on its face. It bans all private civil detention, period. By utilizing this functionalist logic to expand intergovernmental immunity to cover any private contractors simply because the federal government happens to be their biggest customer, the Third Circuit has functionally stripped states of their constitutional police powers.
But a state cannot exercise its police powers in a manner that mechanically destroys an exclusive federal function.
Let me use an analogy that actually mirrors the corporate reality here rather than your wartime military hypothetical.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine the federal government hires a private, for-profit company to dispose of highly toxic chemical waste from a federal facility.
All right.
That private company, looking to maximize its profit margins, decides the cheapest way to handle the waste is to simply dump it directly into the rivers of New Jersey. The state of New Jersey, exercising its fundamental police power to protect the health and safety of its citizens, passes a law banning that private corporate behavior.
Dumping waste is already illegal.
Stay with the analogy. The state says, you cannot dump poison in our rivers. The private company cannot magically waive its federal contract and claim intergovernmental immunity.
Well, no.
It doesn't get to wear the impenetrable armor of the federal government just because it's providing a service the government purchased. So why does a private prison company, a company that is demonstrably failing to provide basic medical care, allowing flu to run rampant, and feeding people contaminated food, suddenly become immune to state health and safety regulations just because its invoice is paid by ICE?
That toxic waste analogy fails on a fundamental constitutional level because you are conflating two entirely different regulatory spheres.
How so? They're both state police powers protecting health.
Environmental regulation and the disposal of toxic waste is fundamentally a shared, concurrent regulatory space. The EPA and state environmental agencies constantly overlap, and state regulations often exceed federal baselines.
True, but
Immigration enforcement, however, is not a shared space. It is a constitutionally exclusive federal power. The Supreme Court has repeatedly unequivocally held that the power to control immigration, including the detention and removal of aliens, is vested solely and exclusively in the national government.
But housing them in a specific private building isn't the core power.
The Public Utilities Commission versus United States case is the perfect precedent here. In that case, a state tried to require private common carriers to get state approval before they could offer the federal government reduced shipping rates.
Okay, shipping rates.
The state law technically only regulated the private contractors, just like New Jersey's law. But the Supreme Court struck it down, recognizing that regulating the contractors was functionally an unconstitutional prohibition on the federal government's ability to operate efficiently.
Shipping rates are not human rights abuses.
The Third Circuit correctly applied this exact logic to CoreCivic. If New Jersey is allowed to ban private immigration detention, what happens when Texas, California, Florida, and the rest of the 50 states pass the exact same law?
Then the federal government has to build its own facilities.
The federal government's physical ability to enforce immigration law would instantly cease to exist. ICE does not have the massive budget, the acquired land, or the trained manpower to rapidly build, staff, and operate its own federal detention centers in all 50 states.
Then Congress should fund them.
They rely on the private market. If you allow states to destroy that market, you allow states to completely nullify federal immigration policy. That illegally transfers supremacy from the federal government down to the individual states, fracturing the union.
Your argument rests on a massive conflation of two distinct legal doctrines, intergovernmental immunity and preemption.
They overlap in this context.
Judge Ambrose made this distinction brilliantly, and it is the crux of why the majority opinion is so dangerous. Intergovernmental immunity, as you noted with McCullough, is derived directly from the Constitution. It applies automatically. It doesn't require Congress to do anything.
Right. It protects federal sovereignty implicitly.
Preemption, on the other hand, requires an affirmative legislative act by Congress. Congress absolutely has the constitutional authority to pass a law tomorrow that says state and local governments may not regulate private immigration detention centers.
They could do that.
If Congress passes that specific law, then state laws like AB 527 are explicitly preempted and struck down. But here is the critical fact. Congress never passed that law.
They didn't need to because they granted discretion to DHS.
The Immigration and Nationality Act merely states that the Department of Homeland Security shall consider the availability for purchase or lease of any existing prison, jail, detention center, or other comparable facility.
It gives them the option to use private facilities.
Which means a state can't take that option away.
It does not mandate their use, and it absolutely does not contain a single sentence explicitly shielding those private, for-profit contractors from standard state health, safety, and corporate regulations.
But it does grant the executive branch the explicit discretion to utilize them, and state law cannot burden that federal discretion.
Discretion to hire a contractor is not the same as granting that contractor sovereign immunity. What the Third Circuit majority essentially did was engage in profound judicial activism.
Oh, now it's judicial activism?
Yes, they invented a new, vastly expanded version of intergovernmental immunity to do the heavy lifting that Congress failed to do. Judge Amber warned about exactly this. And let's look at the mechanical reality of your argument that ICE's operations would be destroyed.
They would be paralyzed?
Without the Elizabeth Detention Center or Delaney Hall, ICE wouldn't cease to exist. They would simply have to transport detainees to a federal facility in central Pennsylvania or build their own facility in New Jersey.
Which would take years and billions of dollars.
Yes, that is more expensive. Yes, it ties up officers and reduces their immediate detention capacity. But administrative inconvenience and higher operational costs do not equate to a constitutional prohibition.
It does when it's a deliberate state blockade.
The federal government choosing to operate its detention system on the cheap by outsourcing to the lowest corporate bidder does not mean they get to systematically bypass state sovereignty. And when courts utilize twisted functionalist logic to shield these corporations, you end up with the nightmare of Delaney Hall.
We are back to the unverified conditions.
You get a massive facility operating within a state's borders where there is essentially zero external oversight. The federal government turns a blind eye to reports of untreated cancer and psychological warfare. The private corporation maximizes its profit margins, and the state is legally gagged from protecting the human beings trapped inside?
The state has no jurisdiction over federal detainees.
The concept of dual sovereignty was explicitly designed to prevent this exact kind of unchecked, monopolistic abuse of power. When New Jersey steps in and says, "We will not allow for-profit human rights abuses to occur within our sovereign borders," that isn't nullification. That is the American system of federalism working exactly as the founders intended. The founders also explicitly intended for the federal government to possess the absolute authority to execute its exclusive national powers without being held hostage, starved of resources, or physically blockaded by individual dissenting states.
We clearly read the founders' intent differently on corporate immunity.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, exploring the deep legal, operational, and humanitarian layers of this crisis. As we conclude, I will synthesize my perspective on what we've discussed.
Go ahead.
While the visceral reality of the protests outside Delaney Hall, the tear gas, the barricades, the sheer human desperation, is profoundly disturbing, we cannot let the emotional weight of those images obscure the constitutional necessity of federal action.
Even if that action is violent, the survival of the American Republic relies on absolute federal supremacy in areas of exclusive national jurisdiction, such as immigration. We simply cannot permit individual states to utilize clever corporate regulations as a backdoor to veto national policy.
It's not a veto, it's a regulation.
Nor can we allow the physical blockading of federal facilities by activists to dictate law enforcement outcomes. The Third Circuit correctly recognized that the promise of state sovereignty does not include the right to slowly, systematically destroy the federal government's operational capabilities through market manipulation. When a state refuses to cooperate, the federal government must secure its mission.
And synthesizing my perspective, the entire framework of dual sovereignty dictates that states have an inescapable moral and legal duty to regulate the private corporate entities operating within their borders.
Okay.
This duty becomes an absolute imperative when overwhelming corroborated evidence verified by sitting members of Congress points to systemic humanitarian failures that the federal government stubbornly refuses to acknowledge, investigate, or correct.
They say they do investigate.
Taking a massive, for-profit prison corporation and shielding it behind the impenetrable veil of federal supremacy creates a terrifying vacuum of accountability. It legally mandates a blind eye. The desperate, self-destructive hunger strikes inside Delaney Hall and the shocking militarized violence deployed against civilians and elected officials on the streets of Newark are the direct, inevitable results of stripping away a state's right to protect human dignity.
Look, if there is a singular point of convergence between our vastly different views, It's the mutual acknowledgement that the current institutional framework is creating an untenable, deeply dangerous amount of friction,
Completely untenable.
where the state government and the federal government completely refuse to cooperate. And when the legal pathways for resolution are either exhausted or violently disputed, that profound constitutional crisis inevitably spills out of the sanitized courtroom and into the streets.
Yeah.
It results in genuine physical harm to the protesters demanding change, to the law enforcement officers caught in the middle, and most tragically, to the detainees trapped inside the system.
We are in complete agreement on that point. We began this discussion by picturing the chaotic, violent scene outside Delaney Hall. The pepper balls flying, the barricades burning, a United States senator caught in the chemical crossfire.
A crazy scene.
That is no longer just a protest. It is the physical, visceral manifestation of a fundamentally broken constitutional relationship between a state and the national government. As these complex legal battles work their way to the Supreme Court, and as the physical confrontations continue on the ground, the inherent tension between a sovereign state's right to protect the people within its borders and the federal government's relentless operational needs will only deepen.
It definitely will.
We leave it to you, our listeners, to examine the evidence, weigh the legal doctrines, and consider how this critical balance should ultimately be struck.
Thank you for joining us for this extensive deep dive into one of the most pressing constitutional conflicts of our time. And before we sign off, a quick reminder to please like, subscribe, follow, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming discussions.
Until next time, keep questioning the narrative, keep analyzing the facts, and thank you for listening to The Debate.